This is an NBC News special report. Here's Lester Holt.
Good day from New York. NBC News has learned a New York grand jury has just voted to indict former President Donald Trump. It's the first indictment ever of a former U.S. president and could have a major impact in the 2024 race for the White House. The investigation centered on Mr. Trump's alleged role in 2016 in a hush money payment to former adult film star Stormy Daniels, who said she had an affair with Mr. Trump in 2006. That payment was made in the final days of the 2016 presidential campaign by Michael Cohen, Mr. Trump's former lawyer, who after the election was reimbursed by the Trump Organization. Joining us now is NBC News senior legal correspondent Laura Jarrett. Laura, lay it out for us.
All right, Lester, obviously a seismic development here, a historic development. Never before have we seen a former president indicted in the United States of America. Now, we have not actually seen this indictment. We believe it to be still under seal there in the court in Manhattan. But we now have 3 sources confirming that the grand jury has, in fact, voted to indict. We also have 2 sources confirming that Mr. Trump's lawyers have been informed that this grand jury has voted to indict. Now, typically, the defendant gets an opportunity to surrender in a case like this. Obviously, Mr. Trump had forecasted that he would be arrested in some respect. We have no evidence that that has taken place. But the typical scenario would be for he to actually surrender at the district attorney's office. At that point, he would be processed, fingerprinted, mugshot, all of the typical processes that you would see in a regular case. Even though, of course, this is not the regular case, we do not have any timing on exactly when that processing would take place.
Now,
Lester,
the indictment itself, will it be sealed? Will we not perhaps see the details of it for some time?
It's typically sealed until a judge actually orders it to be unsealed. So it gets sealed. It's actually with the court right now.
And that would specify what the actual accusation is.
That's exactly. That's when we will actually see the piece of paper that will actually lay out all the charges. Sometimes they go into great detail. That's known as a speaking indictment, when it provides somewhat of a narrative, sort of telling the story of what happened. Sometimes it's very bare bones, and we'll have to wait and see what this one does.
We have been hearing that the legal theory, the legal basis that the DA has been looking at is one that's untested. Yes. What do we know about what the challenge was in this case?
So typically in a case like this, the falsification of business records, that's typically a misdemeanor. So we're talking just up to a year in prison. In order to elevate it, to step it up to a felony, there has to be actually a second crime, an intent to either commit or conceal a second crime. And throughout this entire investigation, we've all wondered, what would that second crime be? Could it be something related to state election law? Could it be something related to federal election law? We just don't know, and it's one of the things that we're going to be looking for when, in fact, this indictment gets unsealed.
So a question that essentially centers on how that money was accounted for, what it was stated to be used for, and what the intent may have been for its use.
Exactly. So it's not actually the paying of the hush money that's the crime. The problematic issue here, if in fact that's what they've indicted him on, is the way that it was accounted for on the books of the Trump Organization as legal fees, when in fact it was not legal fees to Michael Cohen, his lawyer at the time. It was hush money.
Again, if the former president had predicted, what, a week and a half ago that he would be arrested, obviously that has not happened right now, but we do know, again, from our sources, there has been an indictment. Let me go to senior Capitol Hill correspondent Garrett Haake. Garrett, what can you tell us?
Well, Lester, picking up that timeline from a week and a half ago, after Mr. Trump's prediction, a week and a half ago Saturday, that he would be arrested the following Tuesday, his legal team offered a witness of their own to this grand jury, a man named Robert Costello, who had been an attorney working with Michael Cohen around the time of this alleged hush money plot. That testimony then essentially was the last moving piece we saw in this probe for another week. On Monday of this week, the grand jury heard from what we now believe was their final witness, David Pecker, the former publisher of the National Enquirer. This was Mr. Pecker's second time before the grand jury. He's a key player in all of this. He was believed to be the person who brought together Mr. Cohen and attorneys for Stormy Daniels, who might have engineered or at least come up with the idea for these payments. That witness on Monday, again, believed to be the last witness this grand jury heard before their decision to indict today, apparently 2 months to the day after being convened for the very first time on January 30th. Now, as we await additional information about what the charges might be, I can tell you the political reaction is already coming in. Congress is headed out on a 2-week recess, but already we've heard from members, and it's clear that this is going to be a polarizing decision, both in the halls of Congress and politically across the nation writ large. large. One Republican member of Congress calling it a dark day for the country. Some Democrats cheering this on as a victory for the rule of law. Again, Lester, so much we don't know, but the political reverberations into 2024, the presidential election campaign, will be vast.
Well, of course, he has a presumption of innocence for now. Does that change anything in terms of him being a candidate for the 2024 election?
The former president's made it clear an indictment will not change his candidacy. He will plow through it. In fact, he has made the possibility of an indictment almost a plank of his campaign platform, arguing that any indictment in New York or in any of the other investigations in which we know him to be a target would be, in his words, election interference, an effort, he says, by Democratic district attorneys or prosecutors with the Justice Department to do what a political process couldn't and knock him out of this race. He has been very clear on that point, that he believes this is a political indictment, should one come, or should any additional indictments come, and he fully intends to continue his campaign in the face of any additional legal challenges.
All right, Garrett, I'll ask you to stand by. I want to go on the phone now. NBC News legal analyst Danny Cevallos is joining us. Danny, as we understand, this would be unsealed at a later date in which we would learn the details of the indictment, but would it be your best estimate that this would be a felony indictment?
I think most folks are predicting that this will be a felony indictment based on falsification of business records, which is a default misdemeanor in New York State, but it gets bumped up to a felony if the falsification of records was used in furtherance of or to conceal another crime. But I may be in the minority of folks that are thinking that that may be what's on the indictment, but also look out for the crimes related to Trump allegedly inflating his value for the purpose of securing loans or just bragging rights, and deflating his value of properties when it came time to paying taxes. That, to me, still seems like a viable set of charges that could appear on the indictment, even though reportedly there's been a lot of attention by the grand jury on the Stormy Daniels hush money payments.
This is where it gets a bit sticky here. My understanding is grand juries are secretive, that the information is close held. The fact that we know what we know now, does it affect the defense? If they know, for example, that Alvin Bragg had to push this rock uphill for a ways to get this indictment, what does that signal to the defense?
Exactly right. While we may not know what went on exactly in the grand jury room, we have the benefit of, for example, Mark Pomerantz, a former volunteer member of the DA's Office of New York, who wrote essentially a tell-all book that gave us a pretty good idea of what the push and pull was behind closed doors, not in the grand jury room itself, but among prosecutors in the DA's office. So I think that you might find that that's the kind of book that not only made the case for indicting Trump, but at the same time, it also, by giving the other side of the coin, the other prosecutors and their arguments, gave the defense a blueprint for how to proceed. So this and other pressure may have hastened this indictment, although it's difficult to say that this was a hastily put together indictment because it took literally years. So this was not something that was rushed into, although many have questioned whether or not these are the strongest potential charges against Donald Trump, and if the stronger charges might not be those in Georgia potentially, or from the federal investigation led by special counsel.
Danny Cevallos, I'll ask you to stand by as we continue our coverage. Also joining us, NBC News senior Washington correspondent Hallie Jackson. Hallie, let me get your thoughts and observations.
Well, a couple of things here. When you look at the political ramifications, Garrett laid it out well, that this is a former president, now a current candidate, who is not planning, has no intention of backing away from this 2024 race. Remember, it had long been speculated for the last several weeks at least that this indictment could in fact come down. And let me lay out how I think we will see the Trump team, not politically but legally, try to defend the former president from this. Again, with the caveat that Laura and Danny have laid out, that we do not know yet what is in the indictment specifically, but from public statements that members of the former president's legal team have made, they will probably try to argue that this was simply, as they've said before, a kind of nuisance settlement, this alleged hush money payment, basically, that this was made in the personal capacity of Donald Trump and not in fact, Michael Cohen, by the way, and not in fact as part of a campaign expenditure. They're going to do something else. They're going to try to to portray Michael Cohen, who is a key figure, a key witness who testified repeatedly to the grand jury in this case, as a liar and somebody who simply is not credible. We have seen that already from Donald Trump again and again on his platform Truth Social. And they'll also probably point to some statements made by a former member of the previous Manhattan District Attorney's team to try to say that even some former members of this team did not think that there was enough in this case to actually prosecute. This is what we have heard from the legal representatives of former President Trump already. As far as the political impact of this, right? The base of Donald Trump has been sticky, Lester. And by that, I mean they have stuck with him through a lot of this. Remember, these hush money payment allegations came out even prior to the 2016 election, and Donald Trump still ended up in the White House here. The question that I think we'll be looking for as it relates to the 2024 campaign is, what do his current Republican opponents and potential Republican opponents do and say about this? I think there's going to be a lot of eyes on Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who is considered to be the leading front-running candidate against Donald Trump in the primary. Even though he hasn't even officially announced he's running yet, there's a lot of speculation that DeSantis will. How might he thread the needle on this now historic and unprecedented indictment against a former president, Lester?
All right, Hallie, I'll ask you to hang in there for us. Let me go to NBC News political director and moderator of Meet the Press, Chuck Todd. Chuck, how do you separate the politics, or will it not be separated?
They're not separated. They're very intertwined, right? This has been something, Alvin Bragg, when he was running to be the Democratic nominee, to be the next Manhattan DA, you know, this was part of the campaign dialogue there. So this has always been intertwined with politics. And in many ways, Donald Trump has been, some might call it gaslighting, others might call it preparing his base for this moment, arguably for years. They're always out to get me, realize that when they're coming after me, they're coming after you. And when you look at just all the various ways that this has been polled, when you talk to various Republican strategists about ways they've already polled this, like does an indicted Donald Trump, is he weaker in the Republican primary? And it's not clear that he is. Now, the question I've always had on this is, if he accumulates indictments, right? This is the first shoe to fall. If he's accumulating indictments throughout the year, does that suddenly become the weight where Republican primary voters say, hey, we like you, Donald Trump, but you can't win? That hasn't happened, though. You know, the only rationale I've heard a Republican try to make against Donald Trump without trying to attack him has been, hey, he's lost 3 times, 2018, 2020, 2022. Either he or his ideas have lost at the ballot box. You know, he's the Republican most likely to lose to Biden. But the problem is his voters don't believe it. He's convinced his voters he didn't lose in 2020. So they can't even use that argument effectively, that he already lost once. So it'll be interesting to see how voters react to now that he actually is indicted, and when you see the mugshot and you see all those things. But I do think we ought to judge his durability here, not after this indictment, after if another one comes out of Georgia and D.C. I think that's when we'll find out truly how politically durable he is.
Yeah, and I've got Laura right here with me. How do what's the progress of those other investigations, which are arguably more serious charges?
Well, it's interesting. So the one, obviously, in Georgia, the special grand jury produced a report. Trump's attorneys have obviously attacked that process at length, and they've tried to quash that report. The district attorney there had said at some point that it was imminent, but that was really weeks ago, and so the timetable on that is not at all clear. It certainly is not going to take place anywhere near as close as this one is. The charges, as you mentioned there, are very different, and it has to directly do with him trying to get the Secretary of State of Georgia to invent a number of votes, obviously attacking the center of democracy. All
right, I want to go to WNBC's Jonathan Dienst now, who broke, he's chief investigative reporter for our station here in New York. He's been covering this story from the start. Jonathan, tell us what you've learned and how this is going to play out. Our first hint, we should note that there was a stepped up police presence downtown. What do you know?
Yeah, late this afternoon, the NYPD was advised to start stepping up security as the grand jury was expected to hold a vote this afternoon. We began reporting on that, and then we heard that the grand jury was voting, and then the result came in late this afternoon. Multiple sources telling us that the grand jury has voted to indict the former president of the United States. We are told that his defense attorneys have been advised, and we are awaiting word as to when, if as early as tomorrow he'll appear in court here in Manhattan, or will that be pushed into next week. That will be a conversation between the prosecutors and the defense team. Meanwhile, we await to see if and when that paperwork gets filed and then unsealed and made publicly available so we can learn details more about it. But certainly a historic day here in New York and for the nation. The former president charged here in New York in connection with that Stormy Daniels affair.
All right, Jonathan Deans, thank you for that. Also with us, we'll return to NBC News senior Washington correspondent Hallie Jackson. Hallie, I understand you have heard from Michael Cohen, the former president's former fixer.
Yeah, one of our producers, Adam Reese, who's been among the tips of the spear on reporting the story for us, has a new statement here from Michael Cohen. You say the former attorney's former fixer, yes, and that is why he is involved in this discussion over this hush money payment at all, as we have laid out here. Cohen, now we are hearing for the first time since news of this indictment against the former president broke. He says that he takes solace in validating the adage that no one is above the law, not even a former president. He goes on to say that it is not the end of this chapter, but the beginning of the next one. And then he says he wants to let the indictment speak for itself. And Lester, the context and the backstory there, Cohen had been very public in coming out and talking about some of the testimony in front of the grand jury, how he perceived this case, etc., until he was advised by his attorneys, according to sources, to basically pull back on that. He says in this statement, the only two things that he wishes to say at this time is that accountability matters. And he says, and I stand by my testimony and the evidence I have provided to the District Attorney of New York, to the Manhattan District Attorney there. And again, that is unsurprising, perhaps, that Michael Cohen would stand by his testimony, but it is still significant because I think you will start to see, in likely a matter of minutes, if not hours, an effort to try to attack Michael Cohen's credibility post-indictment, an effort that had already begun even prior to this news coming out, Lester.
I know you'll be monitoring social media and some of that reaction for us, Hallie. Thank you. I want to go to the White House now. Peter Alexander. Peter, there's been a real curtain of silence over the last few weeks as we seem to be marching toward this moment. Anything you're hearing there now?
Yeah, Lester, we have now received the official no comment from those at the White House. The president on this topic has kept silent. He's really done his best to try to steer clear of this entire conversation for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is there are a series of temptations and pitfalls that would make this a thorny issue for any president of the United States to witness their predecessor, the former president of the United States, now being indicted. The White House wants to be very careful that it's not construed that any comment they would make on this topic, any comment by President Biden, would be viewed as an effort to try to tip the scales or to lean on Merrick Garland, the Attorney General of the United States, who ultimately will be the one who decides whether or not to prosecute the former president, Donald Trump, as part of that federal investigation led by the special counsel Jack Smith that is taking place right now into a series of different issues, some stemming from the handling of classified information by the former president, also his handling as it led up to the January 6th attacks, his handling of the 2020 election results. So that's the position here. The White House has directed us, as we have reached out to the Democratic National Committee as well, for any comment. None from them here, but there certainly is a desire to try not to watch this as it unfolds, according to those close to the president and top Democrats, not to politicize it in any way. And it's notable that we have seen from the president a real focus on the issues and away from the politics here, trying to focus specifically on the economy, on his efforts as it relates to the budget, and again, as he did just yesterday when he was on the road, really criticizing Republicans on policy issues like, as he says, their desire to cut back on Social Security and Medicare. So to be very clear, a no comment from the White House, an authority issue for this White House that they're going to try to steer clear of for the time being.
All right, Peter Alexander, thanks. We'll ask you to stand by. I want to go to Danny Savalas again. Danny, you said something earlier I wanted to go back on. We have all focused on this case as being about the hush money. That is the case. If I understood you a moment ago, you're suggesting there may be other charges in here that weren't widely talked about. What are those?
There could be. For example, there was plenty of investigation done into Trump's various properties, everything from 40 Wall Street to even his own apartment in Manhattan, which he supposedly overstated something as simple as the square footage. Now, the challenge there is that when it comes to valuation of real estate, that is a subjective process, and maybe it's even more subjective when you're dealing with a brand name like Donald Trump. So it's possible the DA's office may have shied away from those charges too, but they had plenty of reasons for being concerned or not thinking the Stormy Daniels hush money payments would be slam dunks also. There are challenges with that case as well. For example, the issue of whether or not New York state prosecutors can use an alleged federal election law violation the issue of whether or not New York state prosecutors can use an alleged federal election law violation as that predicate crime that will bump up that New York State misstatements or false statements on business records to a felony. It sounds kind of complicated, but basically the question is, can they use that as the felony? The federal election law, do they have the jurisdiction to do that?
Yeah, Danny, thanks. We're going to pause briefly for some stations to start their local newscasts while we continue our coverage of the indictment of former President Donald Trump. All right, we're back with our viewers here. Let's turn back to our legal correspondent, Laura Jarrett. Laura, for folks just turning on the TV, walking into this, walk through what we know right now.
Lester, based on what we understand right now, a state grand jury in Manhattan has voted to indict former President Donald Trump. We understand that it's based on his payments by a former lawyer, Michael Cohen, to a former adult film star, Stormy Daniels. That hush money scheme, that's what we believe is at the center of this, but I should be clear that we have not seen any indictment yet. As we understand, it is still under seal at this hour. Though we do have two sources telling NBC that Trump's attorneys have been informed that their client has been indicted. As for the legal case here, again, we have to see the actual charges, but it is far from an open and shut case. If we believe it to be based on this falsification of business records, that's typically a misdemeanor. In order to elevate it to a felony, there's really an untested legal theory about how all that would work. It's quite complicated. As for the process here, now that Trump's attorneys have been notified, we would imagine that he will surrender in the coming days. That's what would typically happen in a case like this, a white-collar crime. The defendant gets an opportunity to surrender, would come in for processing, which in the typical case would include a mugshot, fingerprinting, a background check, and at that point, they would proceed to an arraignment. Now, we should mention Trump has denied all wrongdoing in this case. He has denied an affair with Stormy Daniels adamantly, up and down, and his attorneys, of course, have said he has done nothing wrong.
And typically, I'm not going to hold you to a timeline here, but typically, how long does something like this take to get to trial?
It could take quite a while, especially in a case like this. You can imagine his lawyers are going to fight tooth and nail and say their client should not have been prosecuted. This will try to file a motion to dismiss to get the charges thrown out. And so we could be in for a long haul.
And it's relevant because he is a candidate for president in 2024. Let me go back and bring our political director and moderator of Meet the Press, Chuck Todd, with us. Chuck, we talk about the arraignment and the process that the former president might have to go through. It's really hard to know whether it's something that he fears or he will hope to use, just based on some of the statements we've heard lately.
I can tell you this, and people I've talked to close to, look, he does fear all this, all right? The idea that he embraces it or celebrates it, I think, is bravado. I mean, I don't think it's bravado. I'm told by folks, look, he really does fear this. He doesn't, he has spent his whole life sort of fighting the law, if you will. It's been arguably a part-time job of his throughout the years, either via his businesses or recently his forays into politics. So, he's certainly comfortable. As one person described it to me, look, he stands on the edge of a cliff and doesn't fear falling, right? Other people who would have indictments, even more coming, would be in a fetal position, right? That's not Donald Trump. But he does fear this. He doesn't want this. He doesn't, he hated watching his former CFO, Alan Weisselberg, in handcuffs. He doesn't want the mugshot. So, yes, he does fear all of these things almost for vanity purposes, if you will, on that front. But I'll tell you what they do plan to do. They're trying to make lemonade out of it. They're going to try to raise, I promise you, they'll probably raise a ton of money off of this in the next 48 hours. And it will be one of these uncomfortable moments. It's why you saw when he snapped his fingers and said, I'm going to be arrested. And I expect people to back me up on this. His vice president, Mike Pence, who may end up testifying against him in another grand jury in Washington, he backed him up on this. Ron DeSantis reluctantly backed him up on this. House Republican committee chairs started the process of trying to investigate the Manhattan DA before even knowing
so did he
when
just,
or if he would indict.
Did he just freeze the Republican race?
Well, I think his presence has frozen the race. The race was frozen because of his presence before. I mean, in many ways, you've seen there's not many other new people getting into this race. This is, maybe Ron DeSantis gets in. The assumption is he is. But there's a whole bunch of other people that look like they're not going to go. People like the governor of Virginia. There's a bunch of senators that have decided not to run. Let's see what Tim Scott, really the most active senator these days, that's thinking about it. But I do think this is going to be a smaller field. And I do think that this is the dominant story because this is what Donald Trump does. He's not going to ignore it, right? He's going to, one thing he does is he will lean into this and he will make it part of the campaign. Remember what he said, I am your retribution. Right? He wants his problems to become his base's problems. I think this is terrible long-term politics for him. I think it's an impossible general election for him to win. But it may be very hard to dislodge him from this nomination. Yeah, this, in an odd way, may solidify him as the prohibitive favorite.
I'm going to throw something out of your wheelhouse. I'm going to talk law for a minute here. You've got these other two investigations, Georgia, and then, of course, the DOJ special counsel investigation. Are they, whether they like it or not, under an accelerated timeline, given the fact that we have an election in 2024?
They have to be. I don't think you can have these things lingering in 2024. I think Merrick Garland, in particular, is very sensitive to this. This is why he named a special counsel basically right after Trump decided to announce his campaign as early as he did. If you recall, last November, the second he did, he's like, all right, I have to name a special counsel because he's now an active candidate. But there's no doubt, I think that Merrick Garland is going to want a decision, no or no go, go or no go on this in this calendar year. And I would be shocked if we get to Labor Day without some resolution on the D.C. front.
All right, Chuck, let me go to senior Washington correspondent Hallie Jackson. Hallie, have we heard from the former president or any members of the Trump family?
We have heard from at least his son, Eric Trump, one of his sons here, who in a new post on Truth Social, of course, the former president's social media platform, says this is third world prosecutorial misconduct. I'm quoting here. He calls it the opportunistic targeting of a political opponent in a campaign year. And Lester, this is of a piece with what you and Chuck were just talking about here. The idea that at least in a public facing way, you will see members of the Trump family. You'll see Donald Trump himself and Donald Trump's allies deliver this line that they believe this is a political witch hunt in their words. This is a refrain that we have heard for years from Donald Trump, starting when he was a candidate on the campaign trail in 2015 and 2016 up till now, even through his time at the White House here. There is a sense, at least again publicly, from members of the Trump team that this could actually mobilize people to turn out and vote for him, to back him up because of what they see and what the former president described just recently at his first rally in Texas as the idea of the deep state essentially out to get him. As Chuck lays out, though, there has been, and I've spoken with sources who talk about this, very serious discussions about how to handle exactly an event like this. I think the next question is going to be, when do we see Donald Trump again, Lester? Is it going to be in Manhattan? Is it going to be at his home in Florida at Mar-a-Lago? And how will he respond? What will be that first public moment from the former president, who again is in an active campaign now for 2024 after this indictment now has apparently come down?
Hallie, we heard the former president a few weeks ago predicting his arrest. I think it was, 10 days ago? Of course, that didn't happen. Has he, your experience covering him, has he been playing chicken with the DA, perhaps hoping that he could, make the DA blink and not indict?
Not even the DA, Lester, the grand jurors themselves, right? He has been saying things to suggest that perhaps these grand jurors are models of bravery, if you will, and I'm paraphrasing here, for, in the view of Donald Trump, maybe perhaps getting cold feet, right? Because when the former president came out and said that he thought he was going to be basically perp walked perp walked on that Tuesday. That was one suggestion that maybe something was happening, that maybe he had heard something. But there were two other things that had happened that had given us the sense, as far as here at NBC News and folks who are closely watching this grand jury, that perhaps this indictment was close. One is the reporting from our colleague Jonathan Dienst, who we've heard from here at NBC, that law enforcement had been preparing more security in the event that this indictment would happen. That was one of the clues. But the other big clue was that the Manhattan District Attorney had offered to Mr. Trump and his team to come and sit and speak and interview with the grand jury. That is something that typically only happens as a case is getting closer to the end. So that was an indication that maybe this case was getting close to an end. What you have seen Donald Trump try to do in the last 8-9 days, Lester, is try to turn around and say, well, if nothing happened, maybe this means nothing's going to happen. Maybe this means the grand jury is changing their minds, etc. I want to be clear here. Nobody knows that. Nobody knows that because these grand jury proceedings are intended to be secret. They are intended to be a black box. So our first real clue as to what these charges, what this indictment will be when we see it, Lester.
All right, Hallie, thank you. Let me go to Peter Alexander right now. Peter, we know the veil of secrecy or of quietness on this. No reaction from the White House. But are you hearing anything from the Trump campaign yet?
Yeah, Lester, as you were speaking to Hallie, we now just for the first time received a statement from the Trump campaign, from the CEO of what is called the Make America Great Again organization here. And here's a statement from the spokesperson there who writes, "This is not an indictment of a crime. There is no crime. Instead, this news is the indictment of a failed nation," he says. President Trump is promising to peacefully end the war in Ukraine, dismantle the deep state, and save our country by putting America first. For that, they write, the political elites and power brokers have weaponized government to try and stop him. They will fail. Again, the words of a spokesperson for Donald Trump. He will be reelected in the greatest landslide in American history, and together we will all make America great again. Those are the first words from a representative for Donald Trump now in reaction to this indictment of the former president. And Lester, as you see, it's obviously framed in the same language as he has done from the very beginning, an effort to try to appear defiant in this moment here, to try to cast this in the terms of election season, a political season here, with a president who obviously only a couple of weeks ago suggested that he was going to be indicted. He said he would be indicted or arrested on Tuesday. Obviously, that did not come to pass. There was no evidence at the time that there was any reason to believe it would happen on that Tuesday. But in the days and now weeks that have followed, the president certainly was able to parlay that into a lot of money in terms of fundraising. A new polls show as he has faced these political challenges right now, it's helped fortify his position in the Republican field, with recent polls showing that he has now expanded his lead over who is expected to be his likely top challenger, Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor, though DeSantis has yet to announce a candidacy. Now more than a double-digit advantage, some places showing Donald Trump with more than 50% support among Republicans right now, to get to the points that our colleagues have been sharing, Chuck Todd among them. Again, the White House views Donald Trump as the guy they would most like to face here. They believe that he is the candidate they can most easily beat, that he is a flawed candidate, but they have avoided the temptation so far to comment on this in any way. However, they have been grateful to this point that when the president called for protests only a couple of weeks ago, very few of those protesters showed up. It really just didn't materialize. Nonetheless, it is something that this White House, this administration, is going to continue to keep its eyes on, Lester.
All right, Peter, thank you. Our colleague Vaughn Hilliard had a chance to push Mr. Trump very recently on this whole issue of this impending indictment. Vaughn joins us now. What can you tell us?
Yeah, Lester, this weekend, coming from his Waco, Texas rally, I rode on his plane back to Palm Beach, Florida, where I had the chance to ask him a couple key questions around this potential court case here. We're talking about Michael Cohen, who is alleging that back in the weeks before the 2016 election, he, inside of Donald Trump's office, as well as the CFO of the Trump Organization, Alan Weisselberg, had a conversation about paying $130,000 to Stormy Daniels, who was making the allegation that she had had a previous sexual relationship with Donald Trump. Trump has denied that relationship, to note. But where this ends up going is in 2017, when Donald Trump was in the White House. Lester, it was at that time in which reimbursement checks were paid from Donald Trump to Michael Cohen. And so the question here that I posed to Donald Trump here this weekend was, at what point was he aware that the money that he was reimbursing Michael Cohen for was going in turn to Stormy Daniels? If we are talking about a potential election law violation here, Donald Trump has suggested that he was unaware of this arrangement before the 2016 election. But prosecutors could be looking at the fact that those reimbursement checks, while he was in the White House, knowingly were going to Michael Cohen for that transaction that took place before the 2016 election. Donald Trump, to note, when I pressed him on that very question, he would not provide me a clear answer as to when he became aware of the Stormy Daniels-Michael Cohen arrangement. For Donald Trump, he, over the last 2 years, ever since leaving the White House, has avoided tough questions, not only about this case, but also the January 6th Capitol attack, as well as the Mar-a-Lago documents case. Donald Trump has refused to meet with prosecutors. He was presented the opportunity to go to Manhattan and sit down with the grand jury to provide his own testimony under oath. But if he had done that, he would have been under oath and would have been obligated to tell the truth and nothing but the truth. He declined that opportunity. What we now see is that this will go to a court proceeding, and at that point, it will be up to a jury to make the case on whether Donald Trump is guilty of the alleged crimes that Michael Cohen and clearly others have suggested that he made.
All right, Vaughn Hilliard, thank you for that insight. We're joined by former federal prosecutor and NBC News legal analyst Carol Lamb. Carol, if you could walk me through what happens next. And I'm also curious about some of that late testimony that the grand jury reportedly heard over the last several days.
It's always hard to speculate about what the grand jury has heard because, of course, the grand jury proceedings are secret, and so nobody outside the grand jury room knows what was said inside there. But the fact that Karen McDougal, there's testimony there, it indicates that the grand jury is being told about what they call sort of similar acts, and that would indicate that that's evidence that's introduced to show that it's more likely that the charges that are being brought against the former president actually did happen because they have happened in other contexts as well. So that's the best speculation I can have as to why they would have heard that testimony.
All right, we want to go to Hallie Jackson right now. Hallie, you're hearing from the president's camp right now.
Well, his attorneys, Lester, and in this statement, it is short. It is only 3 sentences, but his attorneys are confirming. They say that he has been indicted. They say President Trump has been indicted. They go on to say he did not commit any crime. And then they say we will vigorously fight this, what they describe as political prosecution in court. As we are taking now what I believe is a live look there at the Trump plane, clearly, in West Palm Beach in Florida, as we have a network crew who is down there monitoring, obviously, what is happening at Mar-a-Lago. So not a, again, surprising statement from the Trump attorneys, Lester. We knew that they would vigorously fight this. Donald Trump has long denied any wrongdoing in this particular instance. But again, significant as they confirm this indictment. What this also does here, Lester, tonight is put the Manhattan District Attorney in, frankly, a white-hot spotlight, one that he's already gotten a taste of. There had been, of course, threats to his office. He has had to reassure prosecutors working on his team that he would work to secure their safety. And he had been in this back and forth, he and his office, with Donald Trump's allies, not far from where I'm sitting here in Washington, on Capitol Hill, Republicans in the House of Representatives who wanted to bring Bragg in, Alvin Bragg, and have him answer questions about what they also see and what they are saying tonight, they believe is essentially a politically motivated prosecution, Lester.
All right, Hallie, thanks. I want to go back to Peter Alexander. Peter, we're hearing from Stormy Daniels, the actress who received this hush money payment.
Yeah, that's right. I want to read for you what we're hearing from Stormy Daniels, and then I want to provide for you a statement from the Democratic National Committee as well, those who will be helping lead President Biden's re-election campaign, which he hasn't formally announced, but the expectation is he would announce soon. First, from Stormy Daniels, here's a statement from her attorney who says, "There is no joy in seeing this man indicted. It is a sad day, but I have to place a great deal of respect and confidence in the hard work of the grand jurors and hope going forward our justice system will apply the law to truth and fact and recognize that no man is above the law. Those are the words of the attorney for Stormy Daniels, who really is at the center of this hush money payment that is now behind the indictment by the New York grand jury of the former president, Donald Trump. Separately to the political backdrop to all of this, as we told you, there is no comment here from the White House as they've tried to steer clear of this, not to appear in any way like they are tipping the scales in this investigation, certainly not to appear like anything they would say would be misconstrued as an effort to try to push the Attorney General Merrick Garland to prosecute the former president Donald Trump as a result of the separate federal investigation by the special counsel. But the Democratic National Committee is weighing in. And in a new statement that they've provided to NBC News, they say the following: no matter what happens in Trump's upcoming legal proceedings, it's obvious the Republican Party remains firmly in the hold of Donald Trump and MAGA Republicans. The statement goes on to read, we will continue to hold Trump and all Republican candidates accountable for the extreme MAGA agenda that includes banning abortion, cutting Social Security and Medicare, and undermining free and fair elections. Lester, what's notable in all the statements we are seeing from those on all sides of this is an effort really to try to cast this in the framing of 2024, with the real expectation being that President Biden in a re-election campaign could very likely be in a rematch against the former president Donald Trump. Obviously, this indictment has the potential to change a lot of things, but a lot of them trying to frame this, the Democrats, as we're not focused on the indictment, we're focused on the Republicans' extreme policies as they describe them. Donald Trump and his allies and aides describing this as, in effect, another effort to try to push out a political opponent here. Now we'll just watch the proceedings as they play out.
All right, Peter Alexander, thanks. Let me bring back Danny Savalas, now our legal analyst. Danny, now that his attorneys have publicly acknowledged that this indictment has gone down, it's perhaps fair to ask, looking forward several steps, if he is ultimately found guilty, can he legally continue, constitutionally continue to be a candidate for president or a president again?
This is a fascinating constitutional question. The Constitution obviously is silent about this, but there are legal opinions followed by the Justice Department that says that a sitting president is immune from prosecution. But what about the candidate who is not immune from prosecution? What happens if he is elected while he's either convicted or even imprisoned? What happens then? Because the entire purpose of presidential immunity while he's in office is that the president is unlike any other person in American government. You could indict a justice of the Supreme Court, and the court could continue its business. You could indict a congressman, and Congress could continue its business. But arguably, if you indict the president, he is the head of the executive branch, and you literally and figuratively may be arresting the executive branch. And some say, well, no, the vice president can jump in. That's not how it works constitutionally. None of those mechanisms spring into play if he's just arrested and sitting in a jail cell. The 25th Amendment doesn't come in, although I imagine that would happen, or it possibly could happen in another way. So it's a fascinating constitutional question. What happens when a candidate is under indictment and if he's convicted? It may be a moot question because there is no mandatory minimum if he's charged in New York with the charges that most folks are expecting related to falsification of business records. So it's possible he could get a straight probation sentence. But, I mean, at the same time, if there is an incarceration sentence at all, and he is the then president of the United States, you run into a really difficult constitutional issue. And it's probably the case that a state authority cannot jail a the head of the federal executive branch for the same reason that a president is constitutionally immune while he's currently serving as president. But again, that's not in the pages of the Constitution. That is the interpretation that has traditionally been followed by the Justice Department.
All right, Danny, thanks. Let me bring back Hallie Jackson. Hallie, I just received, I think you're looking at the same thing, a statement from Mr. Trump. I haven't had a chance to go through it, so give us the highlights.
Well, it's rather lengthy. It's, I think, 5 or 6 paragraphs here, Lester, so I will give you just the highlights here. And again, this is coming from the former president himself. So this is a statement from Donald Trump calling this indictment political persecution and election interference at the highest level in history. He goes on to talk about how he has felt essentially aggrieved since the day he came down that golden escalator at Trump Tower. He claims that the Democrats, as he put it, have done the unthinkable. They say indicting a completely innocent person in an act of blatant election interference. Again, I'm quoting from the former president's statement that is just into us here at NBC News. news in about the last 60 seconds. He goes on to say that the Manhattan District Attorney, Alvin Bragg, is a disgrace. He goes on to slam him, suggesting he is doing President Biden's dirty work, and then goes on to say that he believes this witch hunt will backfire massively on Joe Biden. He says, we will first defeat Alvin Bragg, then we will defeat Joe Biden. He says, and we are going to throw every last one of these crooked Democrats, he says, out of office to make America great again. What I read several times for Lester to try to get any insight on, because frankly, this statement is of a piece as to what we have heard from the former president in the last week and a half or so, ever since the drumbeat of a potential indictment began to get louder. Obviously, it is significant that he is declaring himself innocent, completely innocent, as this indictment has now come out, and his lawyers have confirmed that the former president, has been indicted. What I don't see in this statement is what comes next for him. If he will get on that plane we just showed and head to New York to essentially surrender himself, if the negotiations are happening between his team and the Manhattan District Attorney's team, and to what unfolds in the next maybe 24, 48 hours or so, I imagine that we will continue to get more on that. We are certainly going to pursue that line of reporting, Lester, but that will be significant. There had been no real indication that the former president would try to resist the legal machinations here, and you heard that somewhat alluded to by his attorneys, who suggested that they will vigorously defend this. They will vigorously fight this in court. So we will see where the former president goes and what he does next, Lester.
All right. Laura Jarrett is here. Laura, does Mr. Trump have to be careful of what he says about Alvin Bragg? Are there statutes that limit or draw a line between what's critical and what may be perceived as threatening?
Well, yeah, sure. This comes up a lot in terms of defendants having the right to vigorously assert their innocence, but there is a difference between asserting your innocence and attacking, obviously, a prosecutor and the person who is bringing the case against you. Obviously, we saw that social media post, I believe it was last week, where he had a bat in hand and Alvin Bragg's picture on the other side. It was eventually taken down, but many people pointed out that could be problematic, especially if, in fact, he was indicted facing a judge. The judge might have feelings about that when you're talking about bail conditions. So, again, he has a First Amendment right, obviously, to be as free as he wants to be in his speech and defend himself. But there is a line that you do have to be careful about, obviously, making threats against a prosecutor.
Is it clear to you how this is going to play out now? I mean, how far along before we would see the actual indictment and the process of arraignment and photographs, et cetera?
Usually it moves pretty quickly. I would imagine that prosecutors are negotiating with his lawyers behind the scenes about when exactly a surrender would happen. But I imagine they don't want to waste much time here, and they would want to bring him in pretty quickly. And the period of time from when he would actually get processed to arraignment would usually be pretty quickly as well. But again, this is an unprecedented situation we're in.
It certainly is. I'm going to go to Chuck Todd again. Chuck, I'm looking at the Trump statement, and he links it all together. Russia, the Mueller hoax, Ukraine, impeachment hoax, the illegal and unconstitutional Mar-a-Lago raid, and now this. Is that what you would expect, that all this will become part of one narrative?
Well, that's what he's been doing, and it's worked for him. If you think about it, over the last 7 years now, if you start with the Russia investigation, he has really conditioned his supporters on this. He links them together. He has always done so. So I think this is why, I'll constantly have people who are not fully informed about our current political system, if you will, and they'll say, none of this, I don't understand. And it's like, look, this is a years-long campaign. And again, I would describe it as, you could call it conditioning, you can call it gaslighting. But he has successfully, I think, at least with his core supporters, made them think that any investigation, any allegation of wrongdoing is just part of the attempt to stop Donald Trump. On one hand, it's the mark. There have been many a successful and unsuccessful authoritarian leader or wannabe authoritarian leader in our history that has done this themselves, and you can find some political success doing this for a while. But on this one, I think this is why this really is going to freeze this GOP race for a while.
Yeah, but
I have to say, I look at this, and if I were Ron DeSantis, I would not get into this race until the fall, because there is no use at all doing anything active on the campaign trail while these while there is an active indictment, there's probably going to be one or two more that come down on him on either the classified documents or what's happening in Georgia. And I think they're all going to get litigated and dealt with over the next 3 to 6 months. It may be that this race really doesn't start anew until we know where these indictments are going. And if you're another candidate, you might as well just stay under the radar and really not get into this thing.
It would seem, though, that there are those on the left, those who are against Trump, who will be celebrating, if not quietly celebrating this news. But at the same time, is there going to be a sense of, we wish it wasn't this one to kick it off?
Look, there's a ton of that. I'm hearing this constantly from sort of the more strategic side of the Democratic Party that are just like, this is the wrong one to lead with. This is going to make it easier for Trump to sort of conflate this one, which there is plenty of legal debate about whether this is even a felony charge or not. Is it a misdemeanor and all of that, when the other two cases, I think, are both appear to be stronger, number one, but also seem more consequential. I mean, whatever you think of Donald Trump and Stormy Daniels, there's plenty of political analysts who would argue that the country made its decision on this stuff back with Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, and essentially going, we don't like the behavior and we don't like the weaponization of it or trying to drag this into the courts, right? And so I think that's why there's so many Democratic strategists that are like, cringing that this is the first one.
All right, Chuck Todd. Chuck, thank you. That concludes this NBC News special report. Much more this evening on Nightly News this evening. For many of you, that starts right now here on NBC.
Headlines, you're seeing right now.